This is the Kirkgate area of central Leeds. In the Victorian period, it was one of a number of districts of the city where common lodging houses were found. Places where, for around 4p, single people could buy a bed for the night. Lodging houses, or doss houses as they were commonly known, were a very basic solution to the housing problems encountered in British cities. Housing wasn't cheap, and most people lived in a large family group in one house so they could afford to share the costs. Many people struggled to find accommodation they could afford. Some may have moved away from home to find work. Others had no relatives nearby. For 4p, you could buy a bed for the night, or at least the share of a bed, because bed sharing was common, and many places ran a relay system where a bed was occupied by day and by another person at night. Common lodging houses were found right across the country in Victorian times, with some of the worst examples being found in Whitechapel in London. The Common Lodging Houses Act of 1851, often known as the Shaftesbury Act, set out to improve conditions in lodging houses. It gave authorities the power to supervise public health regarding common lodging houses for the poor and migratory people, but improvement was slow. Despite the awful conditions that many had to endure, the common lodging house was often thought of as more attractive than the other option, the workhouse, where food and shelter could be sought for free, but with the addition of having to endure tedious and often back-breaking work in order to earn it. Kirkgate is one of the oldest parts of the city of Leeds. The lodging house in this photograph was located at the junction of Cross York Street and Kirkgate, and can be located on this map from 1908. The area was undergoing considerable change around this time. If we look back at a map of the area from 1850, we discover that Cross York Street was previously a section of York Street, connecting it to Kirkgate. New York Street did not exist until some years later, and it would be almost another 20 years before the railway viaduct would run through the area, cutting off the lodging house in this photograph from the rest of the street, and indeed from the other lodging houses on this thoroughfare. By 1881, almost the whole street comprised of lodging houses, and there were others nearby on York Street, Wharf Street and High Court Lane. On the census night in 1881, the enumerators recorded an incredible 52 men staying overnight in the 2 upper floors of this building on Cross York Street alone. It was common for men and women to be accommodated separately. The census tells us the age and birthplace of each resident. The ages of the lodgers ranged from 26 to 71 and included people who were born nearby and others who had been attracted to Leeds from further away, including 4 Irishmen and a Scot. The occupation of each lodger is also recorded, although it doesn't state whether they are currently employed or not. For unemployed workers, it may have been the most prominent or recent job which is noted. For example, one person describes himself as a jet worker from Whitby. The jet jewellery industry is small and quite localised to Whitby. Opportunities for jet workers in Leeds would be limited if they existed at all. Of course, this gentleman may have been simply visiting Leeds rather than working there. It is worth mentioning that the prevalence of lodging houses and pubs in Victorian times created and encouraged a fluctuating population without ties to the community. Most of the lodging houses were owned by middle-class entrepreneurs and investors, the majority of whom lived well outside the area and entrusted the day-to-day running of the business to wardens or keepers. Some of these had criminal backgrounds and operated on the periphery of the law. They would turn a blind eye, probably in return for a share of the proceeds, to illegal activity and blatantly flouted the regulation stating that men and women, unless married, must be kept separate. Tensions also arose from the settlement of immigrants from Ireland and Eastern Europe, and there was a tendency towards segregation of groups within lodging houses. People weren't necessarily welcome at each and every lodging house, and the lodgers and lodge keepers could be quite territorial and turn to violence. Towards the end of the Victorian period, the transformation of Kirkgate, including the expansion and development of the market and roads surrounding it, along with slum clearance programmes, forced the common lodging houses to close or move further away. Several more began operating on Wharf Street seen here and on East Street. Often, old industrial buildings were adapted into lodging houses. The Queen's Lodging House on the corner of East Street and Garden Street was a former mill. There were 34 lodgers recorded at the Queen's Lodging House on the 1901 census night. It is interesting that many of the people staying there are described as having no trade. There is a wide range in ages that we saw before, but it might be a surprise to find teenagers amongst the residents on this occasion, including 15-year-old James Gannon, who was born in Leeds. The lodging house system was continuing to change. Many local authorities, including Leeds, had introduced model lodging houses in response to concerns about criminality and the conditions in many private lodging houses. Given its size, the number of lodgers staying at the Queen's on census night was very low. The construction of thousands of back-to-back terraced houses provided a wider choice of accommodation to people living in Leeds at the turn of the century. But the Leeds model lodging house for men was still supporting a very high number of lodgers. It was located on Dyer Street, not far from the Kirkgate market, and had 383 men lodging there on census night in 1901. An incredible number of people accommodated together in one place. The proportion of people in the city using common lodging houses fell as the century progressed, but there still remained a need for lodging houses for both men and women, especially for those who were unable to find or afford regular and secure accommodation. A registered women's lodging house can be seen to the immediate right of the Marquis of Granby Public House on Lady Lane in this photograph from the 1920s. And not far away was the Leeds Model Lodging House for Women at the junction of Templar Street and Eastgate, in a building formerly used for industrial purposes. This photograph was taken in 1934. Big changes were taking place in this area prior to World War II, and in 1938, council-run lodging provision for both men and women was moved to Holbeck as Shaftesbury House, named after the 1851 Act, was officially opened. As gentrification continues in the Kirkgate area, many buildings are being preserved for posterity. The district is taking on a new look, but the city and its people still have their challenges. Common lodging houses were far from ideal, but they served a purpose at an important time in the development of urban areas in this country. However, the issue of offering affordable accommodation of a good standard to all residents of cities hasn't gone away, and it remains a major problem today.